My name is Glenn Alcalay, and I have had a 20-year involvement with the people of the Marshall Islands beginning 20 years ago as a young Peace Corps volunteer on Utrecht, one of the downwind atolls from Bikini, which was hit with a very substantial amount of radioactive fallout from the U.S.'s largest hydrogen bomb thermonuclear weapon at Bikini in 1954. I learned very early on that all was not well with the people of Utrecht, and it was my experience after having been on Utrecht for 1 month as a Peace Corps volunteer that I encountered my first foray with East meets West in the form of a Brookhaven National Laboratory survey, then under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Commission, headed up by Dr. Robert Kennard, the then director of the Brookhaven team, assessing the follow-up program in the aftermath of Bravo for 1954. In 1975, as a young Peace Corps volunteer, I inquired to Dr. Kennard about the potential harm to women and reproduction as a consequence, a latent effect of radiation, and before the community-wide village meeting between Brookhaven and the people of Utrecht, I was told in no uncertain terms that that was not my bailiwick, that I really had no business making such an inquiry, and that I should stick to my formal Peace Corps duties of teaching English and setting up an agricultural cooperative. That is, it was 20 years ago for me that I began to sense that something was rotten in the state of Denmark. At the present time, I am a doctoral candidate in medical anthropology at the New School for Social Research in New York. I'm also assistant professor of anthropology at the City College of the City University of New York. And for the past 20 years, I've made 7 return trips to the Marshall Islands. I've spent a total of 4.5 years in the past 20 years, including the 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Marshalls. I'm a fluent speaker of the language. And it was always very interesting to me to go back and investigate this question of women vis-a-vis the latent effects of radiation in the Marshalls. Now, following 41 years of the follow-up studies of Brookhaven following Bravo in 1954, it is well documented and acknowledged that thyroid abnormalities are one of the larger problems facing the Marshallese. In addition to a few assorted carcinomas, the Brookhaven scientists have very narrowly focused on thyroid abnormality and a few assorted carcinomas. The question of women and reproduction has always been conspicuously omitted. It was for that reason, when I chose my topic for doing doctoral research, that I decided to focus on women. I'd like to read a quote from one of my 1,200 interviews I've collected over the past 20 years of Marshallese women, one of the inducements about how I got involved. This is a quote from Nene Letobo on Utrecht, and I quote, she says, "Some women gave birth to creatures like cats, rats, and the insides of turtles, like intestines. Most of the women had chibum, Marshallese word for miscarriage, including myself, who gave birth to something unlike a human being. Some women gave birth to things resembling grapes and other fruits, and some women even stopped having children, including myself. Things are not the same now, and the people are not as active and healthy as before the bomb." I heard this repeatedly throughout the Marshall Islands from many women, and it seemed really curious about this chasm that existed between the Brookhaven studies and the perceptions, the indigenous perceptions and observations of the Marshallese women. For that reason, I spent 13 months in the Marshall Islands between 1990 and 1991 conducting a health survey on women and reproduction. And I would direct your attention in my statement. I'm sorry I didn't bring overheads. I should have had foresight to bring overheads. I'm going to share with the committee some preliminary findings of my 13-month health survey that I conducted in the Marshall Islands, wherein I interviewed 830 women on 10 different atolls. In a nutshell, I clustered the Marshall Islands. There's a map, by the way, attached to my statement of the Marshall Islands. I clustered the islands under purview in terms of their proximity to Bikini, the site of the largest thermonuclear weapons in the 1950s. And I divided them into northern Marshall Islands and southern Marshall Islands. That seemed reasonable. And I anticipated there might be confounding variables with my study. I anticipated I could hear Dr. Kennard saying to me, well, what about the problem of selective memory, for example? Moreover, since a nuclear claims tribunal has been established under the Compact of Free Association regimen, whereby a $150 million trust fund has been established in the Marshalls, Marshallese are at present filing claims for health injury and property damage stemming from the tests, what about the so-called greed factor, or let's call it more diplomatically, the embellishment factor of the selective memory problem? My sense, and my 20-year knowledge of the Marshall Islands, if we can call this the greed factor, that the greed factor amongst all 50,000 Marshall Islanders will be randomly distributed throughout the Marshall Islands. I do not think there is one island with a monopoly on the greed factor. Another confounding variable might have to do with differentials in healthcare provision, that is, prenatal care, neonatal care. I can attest to this committee and anybody who has spent any time in the outer islands of the Marshall Islands that health care, and in particular prenatal and neonatal care, is abysmally poor universally. That is, there is no one particular island that stands out in the outer islands as having excellent health care. So I don't see that as a confounding variable either. I direct the committee's attention to pages 6, 7, and 8 of my statement. On page 6 is the data tables. Page 7 shows what I call adverse births or congenital anomalies. That is, I combine miscarriages and stillbirths. And I made a division between pre-1952 and post-1952 in the Marshalls, the reason being that the thermonuclear weapons experiments started at Eniwetok in 1952. Prior to that, they were atomic weapons in the kiloton range. Beginning in 1952, the weapons, thermonuclear weapons, the hydrogen bombs were in the megaton range, and the fallout from the megaton range weapons we now know was distributed pretty uniformly throughout the Marshalls, obviously higher doses to the northern islands closer to Bikini and less fallout further away. So that's the reason I chose 52 as the cutoff point. On page 7, the graph indicates that prior to 1952, before the onset of the thermonuclear weapons, adverse births were randomly distributed throughout the Marshalls. A pattern doesn't really emerge until you turn the page to page 8. Post-52, after the large hydrogen bomb weapons, we see a distinct correlation between distance from Bikini, and that being the independent variable, and the incidence rate of congenital anomalies as you move further away from Bikini. That is, the three atolls furthest away, the southern islands, Jalloet, Namrook, and Mili, we see that they have the lowest incidence rate of congenital anomalies. Now, this is a preliminary survey. This is a pioneering effort in the Marshall Islands, and I am here to request one item from this committee. I did not bring a long laundry list. I brought one particular item. I tried to crystallize my statement into one request. It seems pretty clear to me that 41 years after Bravo and the very large thermonuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands, we still have an uncertain prognosis vis-a-vis women, and I would urge this committee to recommend the initiation of a larger follow-up study to my study, a larger systematic epidemiological study of the women and reproduction in the Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Echolay. Thank you for your material. There are questions, Ruth?
Yeah, I'd just like to have one clarification about
Yes.
the words you used and the items that you're measuring. You have miscarriages, you have stillbirths, and then you have what you call adverse births, which you define as stillbirths and miscarriages combined. And yet, in your oral statement, you referred to congenital anomalies. Did you look at something other than deaths? I mean, miscarriages and stillbirths are adverse outcomes that did not result in a live birth. Did you look at anything that would be called congenital anomalies in births, in live births?
Yes, thank you for the question. In my data collection, and I'm still assessing the data, I have a ton of data. It's going to take me several more months to sift through it. I also collected data from all these women in my survey about children born with serious maladies. I would include those in congenital anomalies as well. Also, another facet of this research, which will come out in a few months, has to do with residence histories. The Marshall Islanders, unlike our popular romantic images of island people, do not stay put. There's a high degree of mobility. It's important to know where a particular woman resided, say in 1954. Did she live in Rongelap, 120 miles from Bikini, or was she at Ala Moana Shopping Center in Hawaii, several thousand miles away? So I'm also assessing those data. But I hope that clarifies the question.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Mr. Echolay? Thank you very much for your material.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with your dissertation.
Thank you.